Okay, so for the sake of the recording, we started with a little warm up here. And this was a solution that someone sent me, and I was explaining that we see the undefined print because that, as well as in the node console, when something is returned or happens on a line of JavaScript, it technically comes back as an undefined value. And so any live console like the node console or REPL, what we call read, evaluate, print loop, or the console in the browser will print that. So you'll always see that. And if I were to do something like, var test, then the return value is undefined. The variable's value is not defined. That's still helpful, but the return value of the assignment is defined. Kind of confusing, but just so you're not super confused whenever you see that. Very good. Okay, so we went over last time Node and a little bit of history of, we have this wonderful thing that we call the internet, and it communicates using HTTP. JavaScript's a cool language because we can write applications that are interactive and move and have cool things going on, and they send data back and forth to systems. But we can also write those systems that interact with data, write them databases, and serve the information from the internet. And so the way we do that is we install Node.js, which we sent out the instructions to do so. If there's anyone who had just could not get Node working at all, please message us. We can set up some time to get it fixed up. It can be, the installation can be kind of tricky to some people, especially Windows folks. But so again, though, with the in-class stuff, follow along, kind of get a feel, watch what I'm doing, but you don't necessarily have to be doing it while I'm doing it, right? So but for all this stuff outside of class, it's very important that you take time to actually go through exercises and do those. So that's why I want you to get you set up and make time to make that happen for you if you're having issues at all. So cool. So today, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about a couple of new concepts. We have arrow functions, default params, spread operator destructuring. So when you start writing more robust programs, you have kind of a couple of goals. You want to be able to have them operate in a variety of different ways. You have different data structures you're working with, which we've already kind of introduced those. And so I guess one of the things I did want to kind of say is, or ask real quick, is in the pre-work, is there anything of particular interest that that anyone wanted to go over before we jump into new stuff? We'll cover a little bit of this. Okay.
I guess shy people make good programmers.
Yeah.
Typically.
That just means we're going too slow. They're just picking it up. Cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little, or in the OK Coders, in this particular repository, we have a little test.js. We'll go over a couple of these concepts, and then I'll be able to just push it up so that they all have access to it. But really what we're going to do is just go through okay, what does it look and feel like to work with a node program versus a script tag? Because there's some slight nuance to working with both, because the way that they get executed and the context that they get executed. Which that is an interesting point, I think, to keep in mind, is that one thing that you run into when you're trying to learn is okay, well, for me at least, like I ask like, okay, well, what's happening here? Like, what's executing this or like whatever. And so it is helpful to kind of understand context. We try to explain like a little bit without going too in the weeds with it all. But just as a point of like advice, like go and learn, it is beneficial often to go and learn like, this is, what's happening whenever a browser is like loading the document, or this is what's happening whenever like Node is, importing that script and executing it, and that kind of thing. You don't have to know it super in depth, just concepts. It helps you kind of, I think, just learn as you go. And also another important point too is when we start writing more advanced front-end applications with HTML and JavaScript and all that, when we get into like the React stuff, a lot of times what happens is there's kind of this overlap of like the Node environment and the front-end environment. We'll explain this later, but like it's just important to know what context is executing which. So one of the great things about having Node is not only can you write like systems with it, but you can also write like dev tooling with it. And almost all dev tooling that you'll work with as a developer, especially for front-end development, is all written in Node.js. So it just really is helpful in assisting creating like tools to help you build applications on your computer locally, and then making it where you can take that, bundle it up, and transform it how it needs to be, and then put it on the internet. So, so that's kind of where we're going. It's something that you'll experience really frequently as you go. And but for now, we're just gonna try and get a feel of like, okay, this is what kind of switching from HTML context, script context in the front end to Node context. So I'm going to exit out of this. So I'm already in my repository here. Yes. Which is in my, if you remember, if I cd tilde, this is my home directory, and I always do a dev. C dev, then I have C curriculums repository, and this is all the stuff you see on GitHub. So. And I had this set up, but for what it's worth, I'm going to go through that process now. So I can do, if I'm in VS Code, I can do a Command P, and I think it's greater than, yeah, so greater than code, this shell command install code command path. Oh, I think I already tried to do it, and I have something with stuff. So, but if this is out of the box, you can do that. So instead, I'm just going to open the data. Just folder. So the whole curriculum. Cool. So we have this nice little script here. And this, if you remember, whenever I know that I have Node installed well, I can do Node B and I'll see the version. In this case, since I'm not in this repository or in this folder, but I can go to it. And then now that I'm in the day 2, I can node to initiate the node program, which is the program runner, and then touch base, right? So that's going to run this script right here. So one of the things about any programming language is this concept of function, right? So imagine that we had you know, a couple of variables, you know, here. And then we were gonna do something like or we'll just do this. Save that and just for the sake of simplicity. Well, obviously like what we're doing here is not super interesting. And part of the problem here is when you think about running a script, when you're like, if this were all wrapped in a script tag and it were loaded in a document, essentially when that document loads, like when you go to that page, it's just going to execute it. It's going to boom, it's there, right? So one of the ways that we can get around that and be able to execute it how we want to is to wrap it in a function. In Node, it's the same way, but you have a little bit more control over it. It's when you actually hit enter here that it's just going to go line by line down that program and execute it. So one of the ways that you do interesting things is very similar is you write functions. So this is all familiar, but now I have a named function anywhere in this program. Now I can just do add, right? Actually, what I need to do is this, and then I need console.log the return of this. Same thing, okay? But now I can do it with, you know, a bunch of times. I can do whatever, right? So one of the concepts here, right, and kind of going back to the solution to our little problem here, we have a couple different concepts to kind of go over. I'm going to get rid of this part. This is what we call a name function, right? But then we have, and forgive my annotations here, we have this little guy here. This is also a function. You remember what that's called? There's a couple of words that would make sense here. This is an arrow function because it uses this syntax here, which is equal sign greater than, but in my VS Code, I have it variables like this. But it's also called an anonymous function. And to be more specific, we call this an anonymous arrow function. So one of the cool things about JavaScript and the way you make really interesting programs is functions are kind of first-class citizens in JavaScript. It's not true for every language, but in JavaScript, we can treat functions a lot like we can treat any other data type. So the beauty of a anonymous function is that we can use it in what's called a callback. Like in this case, what this is saying is, hey, you know, pass this in as a parameter, then use it somewhere, and you know, you can actually go to the definition of for each on like MDN or something like that and see how it's using this particular callback. But it's a function just like this function. It's just not named, and it's used in a specific circumstance. Another use case of a anonymous function would be an anonymous function expression. this is also an expression. An expression would be something where you're expressing in like an instruction or action within the language itself. In this case, it's an assignment. You're saying, here's a variable declaration and then an assignment of a value to that variable. We can also say something like this. And then it can be the exact same definition as this. Now, I can't have two things, or I don't, for my sake, I'm just going to do add name and add. So what we kind of want to communicate here is that there's a bunch of different ways to use functions, and it can sometimes be really tricky to figure out like which I should use. My advice would be most of the time it's going to be apparent to you, and just like I use this a lot of the times because it makes sense to me, and if I don't need to use that, then I'll use a different version. So what I'm trying to say is this is like my go-to. That's like my thing that I do. But then I will use like a named expression function, named function if I need to. And the other thing that I would like to point out, because you will see this in like documentation like that, is there is one other type of anonymous function, which is you can say the keyword function with no name.
What's this type stuff?
That's like, it's like TypeScript annotation.
Can you turn that off?
Okay.
It might be confusing.
Yeah, let me see if I can.
I thought you were typing that.
That's a setting I have to.
Did it say, was it TS or GS?
You can have it for either. I think I can.
Is it an extension or a setting?
I think this is talking about like docs. So. Sorry.
Are you sure it's an extension? What's that? Thank you.
Right, sorry about that, you. This is gonna be a lot clearer. Okay. Where were we? Getting back to the exercise. All right, we got a lot going on here, but what I want to make clear here is functions are how we kind of wrap blocks of code. We can execute it how we want, when we want. A couple of different ways of doing that. So we have our function declaration using the function keyword with a name. It's a name function. We also have the ability to create an anonymous function. We have two ways of doing that. We have an arrow function and we have this right here. So remember, these are just variables. So like that can be whatever I want. This can be foo and this can be bar if I want to. I like really, really clear variables. That's just a good practice. So people know what's going on here. This is technically ambiguous because this is also not this function. So what's besides the whole arrow thing, what's one thing that's unique with the middle, the add expression? Take a stab at that.
You don't have to return it.
That's right. So there's no return. There's an explicit return here and an explicit return right here. So that's just one thing that is common actually in a lot of different languages. It's something that JavaScript implemented relatively recently, so it wasn't like a first thing, but is this idea of we also call these types of functions like lambda functions or something like that. You'll hear different terminology around that, but it's intended to just kind of keep this cleaner, right? So I can get this in one line, and there's what we call an implicit return. If I wanted to be explicit, I would just have to then implement this and then explicitly return. And then if I want to convert an explicit return, like, because this is like any other function, I can then go here and I can like console.log, to see like, what's the data going on, what's going in here. But then if I want, I'm done debugging it, let's say, and I want to convert it back, I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to get rid of that line, and then boom. Now, one thing I did want to point out is that I have auto formatter turned on, and when you have an implicit return like this, you just want to make sure to get rid of those semicolons and then just kind of add it at the end, or have your auto formatter if you're using headings auto formatter all the time. I don't like playing around with backspacing, formatting my stuff. Just let it do it for me. prettier down here, you'll see that that's the one I use. Okay. So, like I said, these are kind of first-class citizens, and you're able to pass them around just like you would any other type of value or object or data structure. They're just assigned to a variable, then you use that variable. And then that variable can then be called. It's a callable expression, meaning I can do the open close braces. So functions are obviously really powerful. It makes it to where this program, normally is just being executed line by line. And now I can kind of take blocks of code, take logic, put it in its own function, and then make something that's much more complex and robust, but also still clean and look nice and not extremely confusing to try and read. So there's a couple of neat things about functions in general. And so just for the sake of this, we're going to use the arrow function just kind of as, like I said, it's my go-to to use an expression, an anonymous expression that's some variable name. What we can do, and I'm going to make this an explicit return, is a couple different things. So there may be situations where we want to make sure that whatever's being passed into my function has a value if nothing is given. Okay. So whenever we say something like a default parameter, we can do something like this. So in the actual arguments of the incoming that are coming into this particular function expression, I can assign it a value like this. And then what's going to happen is when that expression is called, the function's still going to try and use those particular variables, but if we don't give them a value, then it's going to come in as an undefined data type. So let's just kind of see what that looks like. Probably it's going to throw a type error. I'm actually not sure. But what I'm saying is you can call it without actually passing what it needs to have. And well, I need to console log. That's my bad. Okay, so NaN, this means not a number. It's a data type, and essentially what's happening is these undefined values are coming in, and I can see that by doing something like this. And for what it's worth, I always make console.logs have like a note or something so I can easily figure out, because I usually have a bunch of them in different places when I'm debugging a program. But I can do something like this. Which, by the way, you can do as many comma separated values here as you want with console.log. I didn't know that until like year 2 of my programming. So it's coming in as undefined. And undefined is its own special type in JavaScript. And what it's JavaScript's trying to figure out what's happening with those types. And whenever it's putting them together with the plus sign, it's going to say, okay, well, now I know either it's a number or I'm concatenating a string, right? If I were to give it a hint and do something like that, which we don't want to do, it's going to create a string that's undefined. JavaScript in this case is trying to interpret this as a number and trying to add it together. It's not a number, and so it's returning the value, not a number. It's just it's an operation that can't be done, right? So The other problem with that is, let's say that we were to use this function trying to do other calculations with other numbers. At some point, you're going to run into a type error and your program's going to crash. So to mitigate against those sorts of things, there's lots of things we can do. One of the things we can do is, say that we want to always add like 0, right? So now what's happening is, instead of it coming in as undefined as a data type, it's coming in and it's assigning the default value of 0, which also means that the return value of whatever returning out of that function is a number. So let's think of it this way. So I'm going to use this special keyword in JavaScript called type of. I'm going to get rid of these default params here. Oh, this is not a good thing. And I'll tell you why. Not a number is a type of number in JavaScript. This kind of stuff you'll run into in JavaScript all the time, where it's like, I did not know that that was that type at all. And honestly, this is like the number one thing where I'll just go to the console. I'll be like, what is that again? And I'll go to the console, test it out, and be like, okay, so that's the type that I need to watch out for. Typing in programming, especially JavaScript, and like understanding what the data types are that are being passed around is extremely important and something you have to be cognizant of always. There are like, as you get like more experience, there's always like these rules in your head that you will always follow as you're developing programs. And like types is one of those. Because one of the easiest ways to crash a program is to introduce like a type error of some sort. So in this case, we'll just, we're just going to be really, really clear to the program, because remember, computers are dumb and you have to be very, very, very explicit. So we're going to be explicit and say, we want this to be a number and we want that number to be 0. It could be anything we want. We could have it default to, 100 or a billion or whatever. But this is one way to kind of make that happen and be able to give the function some parameters to go with out of the box. Okay. Cool. So we're going to cover. I'm just going to quickly cover a couple other things. I know we're just for the sake of time. Let's just do sprout. So spread operator is pretty simple in JavaScript. It's just 3 dots. We're kind of switching gears a little bit here. Let's say that I have a object. You all seen this before, especially in creating the the e-commerce stuff in the bonus exercise. So I'm just going to say A is test 1 and B is test something like that. So I have an object. And then let's say that I have, a function, and this is going to be, and in fact, let me just say that this is bar, and then I have my foobar function, which we can default, and then just say return a, and then what we're going to do, because this is a string, I'm going to put a space between, and because this is a string, JavaScript is what we call overloading the plus symbol. That means that there's multiple purposes. And because in this context, this is a string, and being explicit, it's a string with my default parameters, I'm going to make sure to put that space there so that whenever I'm putting 2 words together, there's that space. And I can then call this and run it, and I get foobar, right? And if I didn't have those default parameters, it would just be nothing. So Let's say though that I wanted to use foobar to print hello world. One of the things that you can do with an object, and this is, you'll find that this is true for everything that is kind of a, if I could say it this way, a comma separated structure, and I'll explain what that means. But in this case, this has this parameter, and we could do something like, obj.a and then obj.b. And this is gonna fix my problem. It's gonna change it to where it's printing out what I want it to out of that object rather than the default parameters we want. So the other thing that we can do is I can say, oh, hey, look, I have an object. It has two parameters, both are strings, and I want to make those bad boys, come together in a concatenated string and print out. And also this foobar function also has two parameters. And I can send what the contents of that object is into this function as parameters. And the way that I would do that is I would say something like this. That's not how we write that. We would do something like, trying not to introduce too many concepts here. So what I was trying to do is I was trying to spread all this over the parameters, and I guess I didn't do something. Let's try something else. So better food bar. Let's just go back to the object here for a second. Let's say that we wanted to kind of like combine objects. So let's say that we have this second object here, and this has key C, and this is food, and this is the support. So we'll just name these. I'm trying to introduce the spread concept. I'm just going to get rid of it. I'm just going to, for now, bracket this whole conversation about the function piece. And what we're going to do is our goal is to create a combined object, okay, that's going to have A, B, C, and D. Okay. When you're combining objects like this, there's a really, really easy way to do it. Now, you could do it really manually, right? So you could do A is obj1.a, B is obj1.b, and then so on and so forth with obj2. But instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say spread obj1, and then I'm going to also spread obj2. Okay, let's just see what that looks like. Great. So it's a combined object now. The other beauty of that is we can add to this too. So rule of thumb is spread at the end. So what we're going to do is I think what this will do is it'll print out with F at the beginning. I don't think it alphabetizes it. But let's just see what this does. Yeah, so it's going to put F at the beginning. The reason being is because let's say that we did something like this, this should be fine. But then let's say that we did something like this. Now we've lost our original D value in upstream. Y'all see what's happening there? The first thing that happens is you spread this over, so it's assigning A and B. Second thing that's happening is it's assigning C and D through this object, but then we explicitly put a D value, which means that it gets overridden. In almost like 90% of cases, you're just going to want to make sure that you're not overriding your original values. Because a lot of times what's happening in a program is you're dealing with data structures that you don't know what the contents of them are. They can be a variety of different things. So the best would be to just spread at the end. And then let's say that we did do something like this. I'm pretty sure that D would still remain bar. Yeah. So D value does gets overwritten by the original value. So this is, and the glory of this too is, let's say that we had arrays, right? This is a really, really common sort of use case for something like this. So I did not spread this. So now I've combined those arrays. Now what I did originally is I forgot to actually do the spread operator. And now what we have is an array of arrays. So we have an array with two arrays as its two elements. And then those arrays each have 3 elements each, multidimensional, which is a common data structure to work with. But in our case, this is not what we want. And knowing that is an option can help you debug a program if you're like, oh, it's multidimensional, I'm probably not spreading or something like that where I need to. Okay. So another cool thing about kind of the way that JavaScript allows you to work with these data structures is you can also sort of like, in the same way that we combine them, we can also take stuff off really easily. So, or not take stuff off. You can create a constant. I'll show this real quick. That is the same value of a particular one. So like, let's say that I wanted to get the value of, just to separate this. Or let's do combined. Say, let's just say bar. We want bar off of combined. Okay. How do I get the value bar off of combined? So I see that it's assigned bar, that there's an object member property that has the value of a string bar. How would I get that off of combined? And for the sake of simplicity,
Use a bracket and then 1.
let's try that. That's undefined. So the reason it's undefined is because one way to think of this is when you're using a bracket, you're accessing that data structure for that property. In an object's case, those are all string keys. So we could do we could access it, but to get bar, I would actually do something like this, right? The other way to do it is I could do it as a literal, and with the case of objects, like in the case of array, if I wanted to access the first, which is the second, but index one member, I could do that. But I can't do this, I can do a different thing with objects, I can also do this. Both are completely valid, it doesn't really matter. You'll see this dot syntax much more often, but this is also used for different purposes as well. But yeah, so we can use brackets and we can access this member, we get bar, okay? One different way of doing that is I can actually just do something like this. So now I have bar. What do y'all think is happening there? Any guesses? Any wild guesses? So we have a combined object. That combined object has a property. That property is D. This is what we call destructuring, and it's very common these days to see, and it's an easy way to get a value from an object, and then you have a variable available to you of that same name. So remember how I had to do const bar equals combined dot D? Well, really, I know that the value is bar, but kind of what I'm saying is I'm getting the D, property off of the object. But because, because of naming and different things, it's often undesirable to, or you often get a situation where you're having to rename things just for the sake of renaming, just so your variables don't clash. With destructuring, it's nice because it's okay, this is the same name. It's consistent with the property that's on the object, and so it makes it easier to reason about. And I have this variable available to me. This can be a let also, which means that I could then change this variable. I think it's a let. Yeah. But with a const, this will throw an error. Assign it to constant variable. And most of the time, that's what you want. You don't want to be changing the values of stuff as much as you want. You want to be reassigning. It's very important. We'll cover a lot of that too. Okay, great. So I think this is where we will be. Does anyone have any questions? Is this confusing? Anyone are y'all keeping up, or what questions do y'all have? Okay, so this is all well and good. But, here's the thing. We want to do a lot cooler things with our programs. So kind of where we're going to go next is we want to make a program that you can interact with. So in a browser page, that's pretty simple, right? So we create HTML elements that you interact with. Inputs like buttons and text inputs, text areas, that kind of thing you can interact with. And then we can use JavaScript to get those values and do interesting things. How do you think that we'll interact with the program in Node? We are going to create a CLI program, a command line interface program. And similarly, we can create a program that will be prompts here in the terminal. That's how we're initiating it, so we can create interesting programs. This is how programs were initially written in the first place. Before we had graphical, we we only had a command line and we had to write programs the same way. I'm gonna look up how to do this because I don't remember how to do this. And put this up here, but what's our timeline? Do you typically go over a little bit on Saturdays?
Yeah, typically till 11:30.
Sweet, all right, let's do this. Input. I actually really like this little program. If y'all are interested in looking this up, this is a Codecademy and this goes through really well, I think. So I'm actually just gonna post this. So if you wanna like go back through it like later, then feel free to read this article. So one way to think about this, and I think the kind of where we're going with this is, if you remember, this. Was that the pre-work? Is that the midway challenge? Zach?
Which thing? The license.
Yes.
I think it's like day 5. No. Yes.
This is fun.
That's the basic one. Yeah.
So cool. Yeah. So remember this program, we have this nice little function that's going to take inputs and we're going to get all those inputs from this stuff right here. And then it's going to combine, it's going to console it out. So we can make something very, very similar to this. It's going to look a little different. And I want to expose you to this because this is one of those like switching context situations, right? So the way that you do this in the browser is nice and clean. The way that you do this in Node is a little bit messier, but we can use someone else's code in the form of a library that's available to us to make this cleaner. So let's just kind of go through this. I'll just kind of go through this real quick so that if you come back to this article, then you'll have some context for it. So the way that you work in Node a lot of times is with these callback functions like this. So very similar to how like a for each or a dot map or one of those types of functions that receives a callback, you can then you can also send a callback here. And there's reasons for that like are in the weeds, and it just has to do with the way that JavaScript is intended to be built. And but what you need to know is that using functions and callbacks, especially in the Node world, is very, very, very common, and it will make programs look a lot different than they would kind of in the browser and stuff like that. So I think what the best way to go about this here is to also maybe expose you to this idea of NPM. When you get Node.js working, it also comes with this nice tool that's really great called NPM, Node Package Manager. What Node Package Manager does, that's not right. NPM.js. I should have known that was probably. This is a huge sort of search engine index for what we call packages or libraries, but they're things that they're modules that you can bring into your program and use them, and they're made by people and published, and they're open source. Often they're open source, etc. So, like, let's say that I'm an open source developer and I want to contribute. Well, I'll contribute and we'll build that thing on GitHub, and that'll be the place where the code is. But when you actually want to use that, in the case of JavaScript in the Node environment, you also publish that package to NPM for use in a Node program. diagram. Also very, very common to see, something you'll see in documentation a lot, so it's definitely important to know. The other thing to keep in mind here is that what this is doing here is this is using a library also. And we would do it the same way as if we were to install using npm install this. But readline is a Node.js sort of out of the box package that you have access to. Module. Node, if you were to just do like Node API and just kind of take a look at what was all the things that were going on here, the other thing you'll see is all the out of the box packages that you can import without having to install any extra packages at all. Readline is one of them. You'll see a lot of different ones here. HTTP, debugger, crypto, this is cryptography. It's not crypto. The console is available to you by default. You don't have to actually import it. All sorts of great stuff. So take a step back real quick. So again, this is a whole browser versus node context sort of switching and great way to kind of understand the boundaries here. When you are executing JavaScript in a browser, it is interacting with the APIs, the other code and other interfaces, it's a common word we use, that the browser lets it. So you can think of software as like stacks, right? That's why we use that term stack. You have, this thing called a chip, and it's executing assembly code, which is executing like C++ at the OS, at the operating system level, which is then executing the browser, which is then executing JavaScript, right? So point is, we are operating at like higher on the stack, meaning we're dependent on the code that interacts with the computer itself, right? In the case of a browser, it is dependent on what the browser lets it interact with, which is in turn dependent on what the operating system, Windows or Mac or Linux, Mac OS or Linux, lets it. So when we look up stuff on NVN, and we're looking up things like, like how to use console.log or how to throw an error in JavaScript or, something really common that you'll see. I'm just trying to think of a real life example, but like there's like they now have like a payment request API and they have things that let you access your camera. So you can use a camera from the web. Those are being driven by the operating system and by the browser, right? That's why you have to give it permission, for instance. The browser is what is allowing you to have access to that. And so then, depending on the context, you have to know that, okay, this is what I have access to. As a developer, I know, okay, so the best reference for knowing what I have access to in the browser is to go to MDN and just kind of look up what APIs I have available to me. It's, for what it's worth, the web has become so much more robust, and you see really, really interesting web applications being built that normally would be reserved for desktop or mobile native applications. A good example would be like you can now interact with, like if you're on mobile, you can interact with like a vibration event where you're causing the device to actually vibrate. Canvas API is how you do drawings and things like that. So Canvas is a way to paint, HTML5's way of being able to paint something and have like a really, really interactive experience with something that's nested within a div or something like that. You have encoding, you have encryption, you have contacts where you're interacting with contacts, clipboard, all sorts of stuff. And this is all in for you to work in the browser. So alternatively, when we're in Node, we have all these other different APIs because it's interacting with a different part of the computer. This is intended for the browser. This is intended for stuff that's happening at the command line level, at the level of things that you're doing on your local computer, like a file path, a really great example, or the networking APIs to be able to interact with what's going on at network level. So this is different context and therefore different APIs available to you. In this case, what we're wanting is we're wanting to be able to read what is being given to us on the actual command line prompt. So, and the way we do that is read line. So I'm just going to take a look here what we got going on. So we can do this like this. This is a simple program. Let's do something like this. Well, this is using comments. I don't want to. Let's just write a simple program that does something like this. So you'll notice the first thing is this is a very, very similar, this is different syntax, so don't get thrown off by that. This is just what the documentation says. So we're gonna work around it. But we're gonna go back to this article. So they're doing the same thing. Require and import are synonyms in the Node world. They use slightly different, but we're just going to use require, and we're just going to do something like this. We're going to do RL, very similar to how this is being done here with the RL. Yeah, like this. Require. And then we can do something like this. So now we need, so there, I'm just copying this right from the documentation. I honestly don't even know what this is going to do, so we'll just do it. I think it'll ask me a question, but let's do. Oh. So again, straight from the documentation, I need to, this is also really common. So the kind of 4 steps of a program often are import modules, set up modules, do, execute your program, the stuff that you want to do. And then there'll be like usually something you have to do to kind of gracefully like exit or end. The reason I point this out is because it's very common, especially in the Node world, where it's like, okay, I'm dependent on this other piece of code now, right? I'm going to go ahead and import it as a module into my program, but then I have to set it up to use it. And in this case, readline is just allowing me to create an interface to then run this on function, online function. So and then the kind of ending in here is implied with the console.log. That's the thing that I want to happen, and that's the ending. It's done executing that. So let's see what this does.
I think you need to import.
Oh, I think that's probably why.
Oh, yeah.
I can just do it from process. Okay, so this is actually interesting. So destructuring, right? So you know how in the browser, we had this kind of global magic object called window, right? And it's great. It's the global object that allows us to have access to a lot of different things and it gives us a lot of unlocks. Well, the kind of the equivalent in Node is process. So what this is doing is that this is using process, which is available to us anywhere, similar to how console would be. And I can do something like this. I can destructure from process. In this case, process has an input and it has an output. And I can just destructure that straight off of process, the same way I was doing earlier, in order to make this nice and clean. And I don't have to be processed out this, processed out that, right? I'm pretty sure this will work. It's actually, well, I think it's CD in, CD out. And then this will be. So what I've done is, and to be clear on what's going on here, process has some things that we need. Namely, we need this process that's kind of like an operating system level concept. You have standard in, standard out. I don't know, what does that stand for?
It stands for.
Well, besides disease.
Well, yeah, just standard in, standard out.
Standard is standard out, which means that it's like the standard input output for that context. In this case, it's the command line of terminal. So what process is doing is giving access to those processes, those like sub events. And we're defining in a read line interface, this is the input I want you to take, and this is the output I want you to take. That's all that's happening there. And then what's happening is this is setting, when this is doing on, it's keeping my program alive. So I think if I were to comment this out, this would actually just do, if I rerun this, it would just, no, it's still doing it. So if I were to do something like that, but then I were to uncomment that. Yeah, so when this interface is being created, what it's doing is it's keeping my program alive. So again, something to keep in mind here. A lot of times what's happening in the browser is we're taking a bunch of code and we're assigning it to handlers in the DOM, which means when this thing happens, do this other thing. Right? That's all that means. It's taking an event that happens from user input. It's still executing it line by line, but that's why we write that JavaScript the way we do, with functions and with handlers and using the document and all that kind of stuff. In Node, by default, it's just going to go line by line and it's going to exit no matter what. Okay. So what's happening in this case with the readline.create interface, and you would have to read this documentation in order to kind of like understand more of what's going on there. But I know this just out of experience that, oh, it's keeping my program alive. It's not exiting naturally like it naturally would. Now I can make it exit. So process again has all sorts of stuff. It has process.in, it has RV, a bunch of different stuff. But one of the things it has is it has an exit function. So I can say, and then it exits after it's done output. So notice how got here is executed. And then this part is executed only whenever I actually input it, right? So this is what we have to keep in mind is it's a lot more readable to write programs in kind of this step-by-step way, which is great and that's fine. But I have to be smart and know, okay, there's a lot going on as this is being executed. I'm defining functions and all that kind of stuff. To make interesting programs, that's just gonna be the kind of what you have to put up with, I guess. So I guess the thing to point out there is just that, like, just because you put something at the end or put something before something else, that you have to know what's going on in order to know. Someone wants to get the brunt, really. You have to know, you just have to be smart about like what's going on. Just another thing that you have to keep in mind. And if the program is exiting for some reason, I actually do this all the time when I'm creating a new program, new node program is like, it'll just like, I'll forget to put something that's like a handler or something, it'll exit. I'm like, oh yeah. I run into the same problem because I never remember how to do it. And I just make the same mistake every time. It's part of the job, to be honest. So I just wanted to point that out, but again, so what's going on here is we have this nice little program. Whenever I do, then I have output now. So I can do other things too. So notice how I have access to this as well, and that's a different way of just look up. Let's just try it. I don't think this. I don't know. I don't know how it's going to treat the RL questions. See what this is. What question about this? Oh, I have to put a handle. That would make sense. So now we have an even better interface to actually interact with this program instead of just on whatever the line input is. We can use this other interface. This is something else that's common. I'm pretty sure I could do RL dot on question also, and it would work, but it just puts this as a function and allows me to do it that way. So, and then we can, ooh. So now this whole program that asks me a question and takes my input and responds to it. It's pretty much a robot. Yeah, that's how I average. Cool. So you can see where we're going to go with this, right? So in the license prompts, we have some things that we need from the user. We need to know what is your name, what's your age, what's your address. This is information we do not have. We can ask that of them, and then we can have a function that console.log it back to them. So we can say something like your name. And then you know, I could do something like. Let's do this. And since, just semantically, since we know that we're asking it, then we can just call this variable name. It's whatever the input is, it's whatever the key will be. And then we can use this name to then build our license. And then we'll figure out a way to actually like kind of chain the questions together and have it go step by step and then lock it back out. So honestly, this is the API you'll be interacting with. As you know, I'm gonna go ahead and post that. There's some stuff in here that you're not gonna be familiar with, like import syntax, this whole await or async or promise. That's stuff that we'll worry about later. But yeah, with what we have here, you can play around, see if you can figure out how to chain the questions together and make an interesting little program where you take information and then build a license with Console. And then eventually what we're going to do, where we're going with this, is we want to be able to do interesting things that the server allows us to do, like write to a file. You know, in the future, we'll be looking at like how we might do that and interact with like a database or something like that. But, you know, in this case, we can just like write to a file. Very, very common like thing to do is like, hey, I need to know like some configuration from a JSON file, pull that in, read it. So we'll use the APIs to kind of interact with that as well. So yeah, is there anything else? Any questions? Anyone got anything? Initially code theory? Anything you misspelled or need to all right, well, if no one has anything, I think it's probably a good place to stop and pick back up next time. Those of you on the
So maybe we should talk about sounds.
I'm going to stop the recording real quick. Thanks, everyone. Great class. See y'all later. Zoomers, we're going to talk about office hours real quick.